Okay, so in this session today, we're going to take a look at dual coding and picture usage to support learners with their understanding, their learning retention, their engagement, all sorts of things that we can have as an outcome of this approach. You might have heard of dual coding before. It's kind of one of those things that people are starting to talk about now a lot more with the growth of technology. It seems to have tied up with that as well. It also ties in with concepts around sketchnoting, which is you're an offshoot of this because sketchnoting is a visual representation of doing things, which is all tied into this dual coding approach, and the role of multimedia in order to support learning, which we know that students have a lot more access to these days with things like YouTube, in order to help them develop an understanding, being something more than just what traditionally was written in a textbook. Okay, so let's jump into this and start to kind of make sense of it a little bit more. I'm going to use Keynote for this for today. You can do this in a range of ways. Keynote I just find quite easy, and I'm going to show you a couple of things that Keynote offers me if I'm doing dual coding to support my own learning. So let's just start with the concept of the water cycle. I've used the water cycle before to help me demonstrate things to students, certainly around dual coding, etc. So I thought I'll stick with the same concept here. Now, with anything when we're trying to teach students things, we need to start with something that's quite concrete. If I teach my primary trainee teachers about science concepts, and we say you probably want to keep things quite simple at first, because if you confuse people at that outset, you've switched them straight off. Okay, so it's all about engagement. We want to engage the learners, so we stick with something that we know. So instead of going heavily into the water cycle and talking about the mountains and streams and lakes and rivers and all of those things, let's just talk about something that they are all going to understand. And what they're all going to understand is that when it rains and they look out the window, they're going to see puddles, and those puddles are going to stay there until the sun comes out. Okay, so we know that we've got the puddle, and we know that the sun is going to shine, and as time moves on, so as we go forward in time, we know that that puddle isn't going to be there anymore. So the puddle's gone. So what's happened to the puddle? And so the students could kind of make the link between, well, the sun was out, so has it got something to do with heat? Because a concrete idea is that we know that if we warm things up, steam comes off of it. So is it something to do with that? Okay, so we've captured that initial understanding of the water cycle. So we can go back into the water cycle. We go back into having that puddle there. And if I was a student now, I'd start to think about that link between the sun. So the sun's come out. That's then caused the water maybe to evaporate. So we know that the water is going up. That then means that the puddle gets less and less and less over time. So where does that water go? So again, what concrete things do we know from a learner's point of view? Well, we know that when it rains, we have clouds in the sky. So very ominous looking dark grey clouds here. And we know that rain comes out of those clouds. So conversely, how does the rain get into those clouds? And I'm simplifying here. But is it a process of the evaporation of water forms the clouds, and then the clouds, conversely, cause us to have rain, which then causes us to have puddles? So there we can see kind of the process. Now, this is where dual coding comes in. If I'd said that whole explanation, it's going to just be words. It's words to a student. When you look out of a window, there's a puddle there and everything. What I've done, though, is I've used the words in the form of a story. We know that when it rains, a puddle will form. I could build that image in the child's head, talk to them about this idea of when was the last time it rained and what did you notice out the window? And we can get them to start to use their imagination and their prior memory in order to understand something. And then what we've done is we've used the drawing, or I've used the drawing in my sense, to build that picture. And I've linked the puddle and the evaporation and the sun and the clouds and the rain in order to start to build something which is a lot more observable. I'm using the language, I'm using my voice, I'm using the words, and I'm also using the images to help them make sense of what does that look like. I'm also using the story to help build the image in their own head as well, to supplement this even further. So now let's look at the water cycle as a whole. So we can start, anywhere really on the water cycle. Just for argument's sake, I'm going to start with the fact that we have clouds, and the clouds will cause rain to fall, and that rain will fall on hilltops and mountains. So I'll just draw a very basic mountain here. And as it falls onto the mountains, it forms rivers that get bigger. They form, streams form rivers. And those rivers eventually lead out to the sea. When we introduce the sun heats up. Again, I know I'm simplifying, but remember we're thinking about just getting the concepts through. That causes evaporation. Evaporation eventually leads to the formation of our clouds. The clouds then move across to the land, and we have our cycle start again. So that's it. Okay, so again, I'm purposely not adding the words onto my drawing, and the reason for that is because I want that drawing to supplement the words. If I start to now add in mountain, stream, river, sea, evaporation, etc., you're reading what I'm saying, which means there's a conflict in your head between the words that I'm saying and the words that you're reading. You can't listen and read to both things. That's a conflict in your head, and we want to try to simplify that for the students. The other thing that we won't want to do is we want to limit the amount of information that's going in. We know from psychological tests, I did these when I was doing A-level psychology, that the human brain can pretty much on average retain 7 bits of information. You may remember doing the tray of objects and a towel over the top, and you had to try and remember as many as you could. Scientists have looked at this, and it's around 7 objects. Okay, I don't want to go into the psychology behind all of this, but about 7 objects. Which means if I then start to add in here evaporation, cloud, sun, cloud, rain, stream. Okay, we're now starting to overload this diagram with lots and lots of information, of which I've used most of those words whilst I've explained it. So having my explanation and having the words at the same time can help understanding. Now, from a student's point of view, how can they access this? Well, it could be that whilst I'm explaining something, they're drawing the picture of how I've built it up. Now, that takes a lot of skill from the teacher side because you have to be very clear in your explanations. You have to use some very, very good descriptive language in order to help them understand. But what they will then end up doing is making those links between the words that you are giving them, the process, and they're building up their picture in their head. Now, why is this important? So let's take a look at kind of the science behind this. You may know of these like dual coding theory from readings that you might have done yourself. Again, it's kind of popular. I've just done a master's in sketchnoting. It comes up quite a lot in sketchnoting. Alan Pavio, Richard Meyer, people who you definitely would want to read about in terms of developing your understanding of these things. But we're just going to break this down into some very basic things. And again, I'm going to do it through drawing, just to prove the point. So I'm not an artist, by the way, and there's you can probably work that out for yourself. This is a brain, just so people are aware of that. It's always useful to tell people what you're drawing if you can't draw. Let's imagine that we're just going to simplify this process. So as I am learning something, we take things in from the world around us. That comes into my brain, okay? When it goes into my brain, there's a couple of different processes that it's going to need to go through. First of all, it's going to go into my working memory. I'm going to represent this as cogs. That's just my understanding. Again, I tell you they're cogs so that I'm supporting you with the understanding of what I'm drawing here. So this is my working memory. This is where I'm going to start to process things, make links with things in my head, etc. What does this mean? When I process that, eventually that can go into my what we call the long-term memory. I've just broken one of the rules, by the way, by writing at the same time as saying the things. Now, what we're going to need to understand in this process here is that stuff from here needs to get into here, okay? And that is the process of learning, okay? When we take that information back, this is called retrieval, sometimes called retrieval practice, also known as revising. So this is the bit when you've given the students the information, they've got a test coming up, and you're asking them to go through the revision process. They're accessing this information here in order to be able to use it, so back up into their working memory up here, and then that means that they would be able to come back out of their brains, and in this case, answer the questions on the test. So what does this kind of mean over here then? Okay, so we've talked about this idea of dual coding. So this here is the process of where we're coding our brain, not coding in the sense of ones and zeros and all of that. We're putting information into a brain. I suppose it is kind of like coding in that sense. Now, what dual coding will look at, and there are multiple ways of looking at this, is that we have our visual, which is the pictures, and we have our words, which is the language. Okay, so we've got our language here, and they are processed separately. That ultimately means then that we have two avenues, and there may be more. Okay, so in my reading about my masters, I was looking at the idea of that movement we can learn through moving. As an ex-PE teacher, I know this. We talk about muscle memory to know that the people that are great at doing sporting activities, the Michael Jordans of the world, he doesn't think about taking a shot. His muscles have learned the process of how to take the shot. So in fact, let's add another one in here and talk about our movement as well. So that's our dual coding. Now, I read another book, Daniel Kaufman, great book, talks about understanding the brain, how the brain works, thinking fast, thinking slow. And in that book, it talks about this idea of the more doorknobs you have on a door, the more points of access you give the person trying to access the door. So if you imagine that you were trying to access a door that was 7 foot tall and the doorknob was at the very top and you were only 3 foot tall, you've restricted your access. If you put more doorknobs down the door and one is at the height of that person who's 3 foot tall, they can access the door. Now, if you think of all of those doorknobs as being a different way of understanding things, then we're giving more access. And if each one of those doorknobs was a different sense that we're thinking about, again, that can support the learner in that way as well. Now, again, I am not an expert in this. This is just coming from things that I've read, things that I've learned, and things that I've practiced. There is going to be a whole lot more research that I would urge people to individually do around these things. But we just want to look at why would you do this with your young learners? Okay, I'm going to move on from that then. So we've got this basic understanding of how we learn, how our brain works, how we can code our brain in multiple ways, and that the retrieval practice is taking information back out of that long-term memory so that we can use it. We've also talked here about cognitive overload. So this section here, not putting too much information in because we really want to do that. And then there's one last thing to just kind of highlight, and that's something called the picture superiority effect. And this was some research done by some scientists which looked at the fact that if you add pictures to words, you can increase the ability to retrieve that information later. So this section here. And it was a significant amount, about 52% more information if you have linked it to a picture. Now we know this is used often, because if you look at any early learning child's books, it's pictures with simple words. When you look at people that are learning new languages, they link the words to pictures. So there's an awful lot of evidence around us to suggest that this is an approach that works. Okay, so I mentioned before about how Keynote can really support with things. Now, first of all, you can see that I've drawn these pictures within Keynote, so it's a useful place for me to draw things. There is another tool within Keynote, within the drawing section, which is really useful, and that is if I'm just going to merge all of these just for argument's sake. If I go to Animate and I go to Build In, I can tap on Line Draw, and then what this does is it draws that picture as I drew it. Okay, so you get to see that whole process. Now, if I'd spent more time doing that as an individual image, it would build the water cycle for me, and then I could obviously use that to kind of help me understand the cycle approach to things. I've also, using my voice at the moment, I'm screen recording this to create a video, but you can imagine that for a student, they would be able to add their voiceover for things as well, so as the process goes. And that brings me on to this next one. Keynote is a great tool for creating animations, and this is an animation I've created that talks through the water cycle. So we've just got all of the images on our screen that talk through the process. You can see the rain falling, forming those streams, and then into rivers, and so on and so forth. And this is just going to keep building and building and building. Now, I use this with my students to get them to add a voiceover to this. So what I would do is I would export this as a video, as you're kind of watching it now, and I would get them to add a voiceover to explain the process. And all I've created really is just using Magic Move, different slides with different elements of the water cycle. I would screen record this or export this as a movie. So if I go to export as movie, I can choose just those slides, which is about slide 4 or 3. I can export that. That's just going to create a movie for me. And then I would ask the students to just add a voiceover. I could put that into iMovie, Spark Video. There's all sorts of things that you could add this to, clips. And then just say to students, I want you to watch the thing and I want you to explain what's happening. And again, it's them having that understanding of the visuals and the words all as one. So just to go through that process to show how simple that was, if I jump into my photos, here we go, here's that video that I've just created. And you'll just see it automatically plays for me. And all I would need to do is add that into a video program, which would allow me to add my voiceover and record that as a video. I call it the Attenborough lesson, only because students love to watch the Blue Planet videos. And I say, okay, imagine if there wasn't any words to that. How could you add the words? How do you share your knowledge and understanding of something? Okay, so the key thing here is that dual coding is about the learner. I've shown you dual coding, but I'm not doing dual coding to teach you, because it's about the encoding. Okay, so that's the user, so the end user of the information. So how would students use this? So a couple of examples. They could do a similar activity to what I've just shown you then. You could be talking through the water cycle and having students draw what their interpretation of that is. It could be that they write a story, but put pictures with that story to help them understand the process. You could give them the water cycle animation and get them to add a voiceover to it. The whole time, though, we're trying to link multiple ways of having them understand something, not just words, not just pictures, but a mixture of the two. In some subjects, you might go even further and actually think about a third section, the movement element. I remember when I used to teach maths in secondary school to support the maths teachers, as a PE teacher, we would take them into a practical application and say, okay, what does it look like? We'd talk through the words, we'd get them to then demonstrate that. So physically, they would be moving around. We'd get them to balance equations by actually balancing within a physical environment to get them to kind of really feel what those things look like. So there's lots of ways that you can do this. It's just understanding that it's that mix of the visual and the words, and then possibly movement, and thinking about how that all of those things can come together to help that student. So hopefully this has given you an impetus to get started, to find out some more information. Like I said, some people that you are going to want to read about. They are great people to get you started on in terms of your understanding of dual coding and the multimedia effect around different ways of applying visual things into your learning sequences.